One of the main things that appealed to me about the Denver Communists when I joined is its refusal to like give into any kind of workerism or prioritize a section of the working class over another. Like we don't, say like factory workers are more important than baristas, like we saw last week with the ACP, and I've seen arguments like that made online that sow a lot of confusion within the left and socialists specifically. So I just want to kind of like examine some of the distinction or like the distinct ways that we look at workers and why we do that. So the first point that we need to look at is that the motivating force of capitalism is the drive for profit. And profit is achieved by paying workers less than they produce, obviously, and then confiscating the difference between the value of what was produced and what the worker is paid. We refer to this as surplus value of the commodity. Capitalists also may extract value from workers via rent and interest. Fundamentally, the worker's ability to stop profit is the working class's primary tool to challenge the capitalist class and overthrow capitalism, because workers are the primary source of profit. So that brings us to a distinction that Marx would make between productive and unproductive workers, and it you can't look at it like in terms of how you would just like or how you would like assume this would be like productive workers produce, unproductive workers don't produce. It's much more nuanced than that. So Marx does make this distinction between productive and unproductive workers, where some workers are directly exploited to produce surplus value. For example, like a machinist may fabricate auto parts and is directly creating surplus value via the commodity which he is producing, and that surplus value is then confiscated as profit by the capitalist. So these workers are so-called productive workers because they are the workers that produce the surplus value. And according to Marx, these workers have the ability to immediately cut off the flow of surplus value or profit. And so that's why we examine them in this regard as productive workers. Workers not directly exploited do not immediately create surplus value and are thus what Marx would refer to as unproductive workers. And um, unproductive workers still while they don't directly create surplus value, they create the conditions that allow for the creation of surplus value. And thus, if they stop their work, they undermine the conditions by which surplus value is created and can also choke surplus value through withholding their labor as well. This is interesting because it can break from expectation. For instance, like under the criteria productive versus unproductive, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong here. This is a kind of a conclusion I came to, but under this criteria, productive versus unproductive workers, a barista who is, maligned by the ACP as an unproductive worker, they are a productive worker because they create various coffee confections from coffee beans and thus create a form of surplus value. While a forklift operator or a teamster, people that we generally see as essential labor, actually circulate commodities without creating surplus value in the commodity production process, and thus could be said to be unproductive. Um, Somebody correct me if that's wrong, but that's kind of how I came to understand it and juxtapose the actual ideas versus kind of some like implicit biases that we might have. So why the distinction is made, this concept helps demonstrate the distinction between production for profit and production for need. That's why Marx used it. Unproductive workers provide much of what the population relies on, like education, healthcare, etc., but would not be considered, productive because they don't produce for profit. And productive profit might not necessarily suit the needs of people. For instance, Beanie Babies made a profit, but they're not helpful to people, and they just fill our attics and landfills at this point. So that is to say, unproductive workers are actually essential. To quote from the article, capitalism is dependent on quantities of labor which do not directly build its bottom line. And again, we see that in the form of like education, childcare, healthcare, etc. Uh, and unproductive labor also increases as capitalism increases. This is because as labor's capability is increased, it frees up labor for the capitalists to use to fight over previously produced surplus value, so like bankers, etc. And this is part of the root of financialization of capitalism. We see a shift away from producing goods and services and towards financial means to capture or speculate on surplus value already created. Um, Now, Marx did not make a moral distinction in favor of one type of labor. Productive labor can create weapons and luxuries that have far less human value than unproductive labor can in its forms of education, healthcare, etc. This is also important because it helps us to reject a narrow strategy. So productive workers can directly cut off profit. This is which has led to some discounting the struggle of unproductive workers who cannot directly cut off profit. However, unproductive workers can create the conditions that allow for the accumulation of profit, and thus, if they strike, they are essential to the capitalist system, and thus, if they strike, they will eventually strangle capital as well. Um, so like, and you can think about this like workers that are essential to the circulation of commodities, but not their production. What would happen if they went on strike? If forklift drivers went on strike, goods would not ship. Unproductive labor, withholding their labor power would disrupt the system, therefore, and there is no direct strategic power tied to the production of surplus value versus that held by unproductive labor. There's also the distinction of public and private workers. And this is distinct from the idea of productive and unproductive workers. Private workers obviously work for private capital, while public workers work for a public entity. Public workers may be productive, like the article gives the example of the utility workers, which produce power, and private workers may be unproductive. Marx notes that the working class is collectively exploited despite there being subcategories of workers, and that unproductive and productive workers' wages are inherently linked, influencing one another, and therefore workers have a unity in their interests. Um, in a communist society, we'll see the concept of surplus value disappear, and thus the concept of concept of productive and unproductive labor also disappear. A socialist society will need to care for and retrain those whose jobs are made obsolete by the dissolution of capital. And the objection to capitalism comes from the exploitation of the working class as a whole. Communists support the fight of all workers against exploitation. And the working class as a whole is engaged in a struggle against the capitalist class as a whole. Chris Harman makes a distinction about what Marx came to argue that productive labor and unproductive labor were later in life. In his book Zombie Capitalism, he argues that the definition changed to productive labor being that which maintains the working class or capital accumulation, which I think is a pretty useful definition, actually. So why Marx looked to the working class? The working class is central to Marxism. Marxism is the theory of international proletariat revolution, argued John Molyneux, and socialism is the self-emancipation of the working class. The reason Marxism orients itself towards the working class is because they produce the wealth that capitalism is based on, while they are exploited by the capitalist class. Essentially, the wealth of the worker or the wealth the worker produces is stolen from them. The working class as a whole is engaged in class struggle against. I said that already. Sorry. Revolutionary transformation of capitalism to socialism is necessary but not inevitable. Either the revolutionary class takes power and creates a new social order, or it will lead to the mutual ruin of contending classes, or socialism or barbarism. This brings us to the idea of the Vanguard Party versus implantation. The Vanguard Party is a party made up exclusively of revolutionaries to lead the working class to a successful revolution. It needs to be of the working class, but working class consciousness is divided. So the Vanguard advocates for revolutionary struggle and policies, and this should not be achieved through implantation. Implantation or industrialization sends students or Marxists into industrial jobs to try and engage the class alongside workers and win them to Marxist ideas and recruit in crucial industries right now. The problem with this is it ignores other sectors of the population. And as Steve points out in the article, we don't know what sectors of the economy will be essential in the future, nor when the revolution itself will break out. So implantation can put the cart before the horse. It also has an archaic idea of who constitutes the working class, in which it fetishizes the industrial worker or productive workers. This can lead to workerism, which I said, I appreciate that we reject, where workers have more worth than others, and industrial workers have more worth than their companions. And it also leads to opportunism by supporting the cultural and politic of so-called real workers, which could be homophobic, etc. This position also ignores the special oppression of various groups and marginalized peoples. Um, this allows the festering of isms like racism, sexism, etc., to fracture the working class. So our goal is to create interventionist propaganda groups, which create and develop cadre, and builds out a large, developed revolutionary organization that allows for the relation to struggle and to meet people where they're at. And I mean that literally, like we go to protest to meet people, to meet layers of the working class that are at least somewhat radicalized and looking to develop their politics further. And we also have to pay attention to special oppression and other political struggles and recognize that Marxist education is key and that workers will find liberation through Marxist education and applying those ideas.